Welcome, everyone. Just wait another minute as people start sort of trickling in. So you can see the numbers going up quite high. Great. Okay. I'll just get started just because we've got quite a lot to cover in this 1 hour. So welcome everyone to our first webinar in our 3-part series looking at occupational segregation. And we're really pleased to have so many people joining us today from different sectors across Scotland. So my name is Kelsey Smith. I'm the head of Equally Safe at Work at Close the Gap. So I'll be introducing our speakers today and then facilitating the Q&A at the end. So just a bit of a background on the webinar. So tackling occupational segregation is key to our work at Close the Gap, and we know that it's not well understood by policymakers, different employers, and others who might be working on women's employment. So often what we hear from employers that we work with is, okay, but what can we actually do about occupational segregation? How do we make progress on it? What are other organizations doing? Sometimes there's hope that occupational segregation will just sort itself out without taking any actions. And sometimes employers assume that you have to address all sectors all at once, which obviously can seem quite daunting. So that's why we wanted to focus in on this issue and spend time over the next 3 webinars looking at what it is, what the causes are, and what can be done to actually address occupational segregation. So we'll also be hearing some good practice examples from different organizations through the webinar series. And so the series, Men's Jobs and Women's Jobs, How Work Got This Way and What We Can Do About It, kicks off Close the Gap's 25th anniversary celebrations. So we'll also be sharing more events, blogs, activities throughout the year as part of our anniversary celebration. So keep your eye out for that. Just a few notes. So we've got live captioning that's been enabled for the event. So to access that, you can click on the 3-dot button that says more at the top of your screen, then language and speech, then live captioning. We'll also be recording the event and then we'll share the link afterwards. So we'll upload it to our YouTube channel and then share it in a follow-up email. And so we'll also be hearing from our 3 speakers today, and we'll save questions until the end, so you can submit your questions through the Q&A button. And if we're unable to respond to all the questions, then we'll endeavour to answer them after the event through an email update. And so I'll just immediately get going and sort of introduce our first speaker. So the first speaker is Anna Ritchie-Allen, who is the Executive Director of Close the Gap, and will set the scene by outlining what occupational segregation is and why it happened. So just hand over to you then, Anna.
Thanks, Kelsey. I'm just going to share some slides. Second. There we go. Okay, so yeah, as Kelsey mentioned, occupational segregation is something that we talk about at Close the Gap all the time. It underpins so much of our work and the areas that we talk about to employers and to policymakers. So I'm just going to give an overview, a very quick overview, given it's actually quite complicated, all the factors which contribute to it. But what we know is that it's one of the main causes of the gender pay gap. It's a persistent challenge. It's a key feature of Scotland's labour markets and labour markets everywhere, essentially. And yet there's been very little progress on it over the years. So if we look at what's happening in Scotland's labour market, and don't worry, this isn't going to be all charts, but we can see here that the recent data from the census, which looks at the jobs which women and men do, it shows, even just by looking at the differences in colours, we can see where there's some quite acute segregation. And even looking at those that are a little bit more equal, so for the top one, so for managers and senior positions, even though women just make up 40% of workers in those jobs, despite that they have more likely to have a degree at every single age practically. So, but the jobs in which we can see women are most prominent in are around admin. For example, you can see there 76. Skilled trades, just 11% are women. Care, so care, leisure and other service, 80%. Sales and customer service, 63%. And you can see they're just 16% of process, plant and machine operatives. And that's the very high level statistics. And if you look underneath those, like the more layers that you unpeel, then the more segregation that you find. So something that looks quite equal, like a professional, so it's like 45% men and 55% women. But actually, once you start looking at the types of jobs they are, such as engineers and nurses, then you know that men are more likely to be engineers and women are more likely to be nurses. A quick look at the industries that women work in. Again, you can see the pattern there in terms of women's employment being concentrated at the top of the chart there. So women are more likely to work in human health and social work activities and education, and those are found in the public sector. And men are more likely to be found in other sectors such as construction, manufacturing, energy. And we've got Dilraj here from Equate Scotland, who's going to be talking a bit about that more later on. This is important in thinking about economic performance as well, because those sectors which have got the most acute segregation are also those that have skills shortages. So STEM sectors, but also things like childcare and social care. What we know about women's experiences is that they're not a homogenous group. And once you start looking at disabled women, racially minoritized women, single parents, you find that they are particularly affected by occupational segregation. So at the end of last year, Close the Gap published research on disabled women's employment. And I just thought it'd be useful to share a chart from that research. You don't have to look closely at the numbers here. It's the shape of the chart that you can look at. But disabled women face even more acute occupational segregation. So more than 40% of their employment is in health and social care or education. And they're just a tiny 2% of skilled trades jobs. And again, you can see that they face this double glass ceiling. So they're less likely to be in management positions and less likely to be in management positions compared to disabled men, non-disabled men, and disabled women. So if we know that occupational segregation means that men and women do different types of work and different levels of work, then trying to work out how this happens, and this is really getting into the detail of the webinars that we're hoping to cover. There's quite a lot of factors which contribute to occupational segregation. But we're just going to look at the three main ones. So there's gender norms and stereotypes, which Susie is also going to be talking about. So I won't go into that in huge much detail. She's going to be talking about early years. We have the undervaluation of women's work, and that's the work that's seen as stereotypically women's work. So things like caring, catering, cleaning, admin, and other jobs as well, like nursing. And then there's inflexible work, which is probably the most recognisable thing to people generally. Generally, people know what flexible working is. So, thinking at the very start about what this means in relation to work. And I was looking back over some of the presentations that Close the Gap has done and some of the training that we've done over the last 10 plus years. And we've got lots of things that we've snipped which really exemplify about 10 years ago, it was called the pinkification of toys and clothes and so on. And I was quite struck by how normalised that's become now, that it doesn't seem out of the ordinary now. And how that contributes, which we've known, is that anyone with a child in their life will recognise some of this. And children and young people are sent thousands and thousands of messages every day about how they should be. And what that means is that their ideas about gender and work become quite fixed from an early age. And that is really central. And I won't go into that in too much detail because Susie will be, I think, talking about some of those things. But the way that the agenda's moved on quite a bit from pinkification, and what now that the concerns are about school settings and classroom settings is the increase in sexism and misogyny in classroom and online harm with the advent of the internet. Girl Guiding published some helpful annual surveys to get a snapshot of how girls and young women are feeling about things and what they think about different aspects of society and their lives. A recent survey, they asked about whether or not girls and young women had seen or experienced sexism in their daily lives at school, college, university, or work. And that figure was 66%, up from 58 when they last asked the question in 2018. I think we can probably confidently say as well that the number is probably higher as who's experiencing sexism, because we know that it's so normalised that it's often quite invisible for some to see. The relevance of this is that the impact of stereotyping and sexism is around who studies which subjects and therefore who goes on to do which jobs. So some other data from one of their surveys was around seeing what they think about whether or not girls are interested in STEM or teased. And we can see as girls and young women get older, they're more likely to agree with this. Similarly, it's a perception about, women's role within society, and we can see more than almost 3/4, of 11 to 21-year-olds felt that women have to work much harder than men to succeed. And they're correctly perceiving exactly what it's like within the workplace in many cases. So what all of this means in terms of subject segregation is that girls are more likely to study some subjects and boys are more likely to study others. You can see that STEM divide straight away. And also what it means is the subjects that girls are more likely to study usually filter into, but not always, jobs that are paid less in the labour market and vice versa for boys. So that very quick overview is trying to present occupational segregation is a cradle to the labour market problem, which is one of the reasons why it's so hard to shift, because you can't just have action on one particular point and no other points of that pipeline. So that's quite an important factor. One of the other things I wanted to mention, which we're going to have a webinar on later on in the series, is around undervaluation. And that's something else that we talk about quite a lot. What it is, we talk about the undervaluation of women's work, and it happens in two different ways. There's the sector-wide undervaluation, which is where the work itself in a job is entirely undervalued in the economy. So the examples that are often used are in terms of social care and childcare. Then there's the individual undervaluation, which happens, which is when a woman is paid less than a man for doing the same or the equivalent job. This is a concept that underpins occupational segregation and pay discrimination and the gender pay gap. It's so absolutely central, and yet a lot of people, I think there's a really low understanding of that unless you've been involved in equal pay issues. And what it means is a term from economics, and what it means is essentially that women's skills are valued less than male counterparts, and that they receive lower pay from investing in their education and their work experience. So going back to the education point, we know that girls tend to outperform boys at all stages of education, more likely to have a degree. And you see some progress in terms of young women entering the labour market, but the attrition rate from some subjects and some jobs, say in STEM, for example, is extremely high. And I'm sure Dilraj will talk about that a little bit more. And whereas the work, such as childcare, social care, nursing, retail, these types of jobs, the skills are valued less because women are perceived to be naturally better at caring roles, for example. If there was one thing that COVID showed, we thought it closed the gap, which was how absolutely essential this work is to Scotland's economy. So we saw clapping for carers and so on, people going out on their doorsteps every night, but still at the end of the day, most of the workers who were doing that were on minimum wage jobs with limited options for progression, often in insecure work. And all of this contributes towards women's poverty and child poverty. And equal pay issues, we could have a whole webinar on that. I'm sure we'll come into it in undervaluation, but it's been a persistent challenge in different sectors in the labour market, primarily in the public sector, but also now we see that becoming an increasing problem in retail. But what we do know is that tackling undervaluation and the low pay that's attached to women's work is an absolutely fundamental step in getting more men into these jobs and tackling skills shortages. Because there's no imperative for a lot of men to go start working in social care when you can go and get another job, say in Aldi, that you get paid more for that. So why you would go into a demanding job like social care is almost like a moot point. Final area I wanted to mention was around flexible and part-time work. As I've mentioned, gender norms are absolutely central to the organisation of society. Women tend to do the majority of caring for children, older people and disabled people. Now, because there isn't enough flexible and quality part-time work in the labour market, that means that many women, when they have children or they have a caring role, they have to reduce their hours or find another job that's going to fit in with that. And so that is a quandary that many women face. It's such a commonality. And the lack of adequate childcare and affordable childcare is just a contributing factor to that, which means that many women aren't able to work full-time if they need to or if they want to. So what that means is that the availability of flexible work can trap women in jobs and sectors, because most part-time work tends to be found in lower grades of the organisation and in lower paid sectors in jobs. But it also means a lot for progression as well, because you could be in a middle level job and you've got a supportive line manager and you're not sure, or you know that you won't get that flexibility. And so you don't want to leave that job while you've got these other responsibilities. So it's really fundamental. And even though we've seen a shift in terms of in the post-COVID context, in terms of more hybrid working, the reality was that a lot of women weren't able to work from home during COVID. So, and a lot of those jobs can't be done from home. So it's not just about home or hybrid working as well. It's about other types of flexibility, particularly in frontline roles. And I suppose what we've also seen is a bit of a backlash to that when we see persistent cultural resistance and biases, particularly from some of the larger corporate companies in terms of their return to work mandates and deep suspicion about people working from home, which is exactly the type of flexibility that, for example, disabled women need or neurodivergent women prefer in order that they can do their job to the best of their ability. So why does all this matter? You could say, well, there's the notion of choice. Girls and boys and men and women are choosing what jobs they do. They can choose what subjects they study. But actually, we need to question the very concept of choice, and because of the constraints that are around that. We know that young women are acquiring more skills, but they're not being rewarded in the labour market. And the concentration of women within low-paid work means that it is a constant contributor to women's poverty and child poverty. And then from the other side, when we know that women are working below their skill levels, those skills are unused in the economy, and it's employers that are missing out from that as well. And some time ago, we did a bit of research to try to work out exactly what the cost was to Scotland's economy. And that showed that equalising men and women's employment could add 17 billion to Scotland's economy. So it's a real drag on growth. I'm almost out of time, or just about out of time, but I'll just leave you with this slide. I'm not going to speak through those. It's more to give you a sense of probably some of the things that are going to come up in this webinar. As you can see, it's a fairly chunky problem that requires action from all the way along the skills and pipeline. So it's not just policymakers and government, it's employers, it's parents need to think about this, it's everyone in the workplace that needs to think about behaviours and attitudes and assumptions about what girls and boys and men and women are able to do, all the way thinking from economic policy and to the types of jobs that governments invest in, to workplace cultures, to what happens in classrooms and the way that behaviour is managed in that, and to how unpaid work is divided up in the home. So there's lots and lots of things that I think we're going to be covering here. And that is me. I think I'm just perhaps 1 minute over. Sorry, Kelsey.
No, thanks, Anna. That was impressive. You covered quite a lot within that 15 minutes, and I think it was quite helpful for, I'll stop spotlighting you there, unpacking the issue of occupational segregation and really demonstrating how big an issue it is. But that last slide of sort of what needs to be changed, I think is really helpful, because as I said, I think a lot of people just see it as this big issue that nothing can be done about. So helpful for thinking about what's next. So I'll just then introduce our next speaker. So I'll start spotlighting you, Dilraj. So our next speaker is Dilraj Soki Watson, who's the director of Equate Scotland, who are the national organisation that work on equality, diversity and inclusion in the STEM sector. And Dilraj will be speaking about women's experience and occupational segregation within the STEM sector. So over to you, Dilraj.
Thank you, Kelsey, and thank you, Anna, for that very comprehensive presentation on such a difficult topic. You've covered so much in such a short time. I just wanted to, before I start, I just wanted to reflect on the flexible working element. You're absolutely right. As in, if they want to do something with the next lunch hour, is to just go and search which leaders are asking workers to come back, and what you're going to see is white men who probably have an amazing ecosystem of support behind the backs with their wives running families and all the sort of support they need, asking people to come back to the workforce, and they have vested interest in real estate and pensions here. So it's actually flexible working is again being used as a, it's a misdirect. It's not flexible working, it's investment in real estate. And so, yeah, I just want to kind of reflect on that absolutely the evidence is out there that it's leading to more productivity, it's leading to much more mental well-being of the workforce. So there's a lot more to be said about flexible working. Thank you for that. And I'm just going to try sharing my slide deck and see if I get it right the first time round. I'll see if you can just let me know if that seems to be okay. Thank you. So thank you, Anna. Anna covered very eloquently the kind of the causes, and I just want to very briefly reflect on the differences between horizontal segregation and vertical segregation, because they manifest differently, and nothing unexpected, but they do manifest differently within the STEM ecosystem, which means that each phenomena needs to be looked at from a different lens, and the sort of interventions we need to consider have to be kind of in that context. So just quickly, the issues we face within the context of STEM and gender disparity is horizontal segregation and vertical segregation. So horizontal segregation, if I have to very briefly reflect on, is the clustering of genders in certain fields. That's a very clunky definition, but it's about certain genders doing certain sort of jobs. And the kind of causes of that are manifold. The first is what Anna's talked about, educational choices. So girls starting to kind of take on lesser kind of subjects around physics and engineering, even though they perform equally well at GCSE level. And these then lead to gendered subject choices and gendered pathways as they kind of go further along the skills pipeline. And what we tend to see is that the participation of girls and women drop at kind of key milestones, whether it's at GCSE level, then whether it's at university level, and then when they start employment, and when it's 4 or 5 years into employment. And there's reasons for that. So it's all got to do with the support they're receiving in those particular ecosystems, or the lack of, is what is one of the reasons why we see the significant drop in numbers. Then there's this issue of prevailing norms, where women tend to enter sectors like health, education, and life sciences, which are, of course, within the realms of STEM, but they don't kind of, they don't relate to kind of the hardcore subjects of engineering and physics, rather than looking into sectors like tech, engineering, and construction. And what's happening there is that we are finding clusters of men and women entering different sectors. So that's what horizontal segregation looks like in this kind of STEM ecosystem. We then have the issue of gendered norms and socialization, where excuse me, as Anna's already briefly talked about, men's work versus women's work, what is classed as the typical hard hat kind of role, and men choosing more technical and manual roles, whereas women seem to be choosing more caring or service related roles. And that then is reinforcing those stereotypes. You're likely to go on to sectors which have people who are similar to you, who look like you, or are kind of frame similar kind of backgrounds. So that perpetuates that stereotyping. Then the reality of work-life balance. Women are more likely to seek flexible part-time work, which then means that they tend to move into sectors which can support that sort of choice. And that again is more likely to be teaching, healthcare, and admin. So it's almost the system is perpetuating those choices, and those choices are leading to you going into those particular sectors. Then we've got what we call the structural labor market factors. Now, this is something which we really find in the context of apprenticeships, which Equate Scotland works with different partners on. So there's this whole gendered apprenticeship routes, where when you look at the recruitment practices and kind of the onboarding practices, they do not consider the needs, the gendered needs of the candidates. You'll also find male dominance in certain trades and engineering, and of course, as I mentioned, female dominance in certain sectors. And that again is institutionalized, so the system's not really doing much about how those choices are being made. And how does this look like when it comes to vertical segregation? So you've got women in the pipeline now. Okay, they've made it into the STEM ecosystem. They're 4 or 5 years into the jobs. And then what they start experiencing may not be 4 or 5 years, maybe even really early on, discrimination, a very non-inclusive workplace culture, which does not understands which does not sustain their kind of commitment. Then there's barriers to hiring and promotion, and then there's the gender pay gap. And then that means women and minority groups are less likely to reach senior or leadership roles in those spaces. We've also kind of talked a bit about workplace culture, male-dominated environments, lack of mentoring and networks, limited career progression routes, which also are quite significant factors for women to remain in lower status positions. On the back of that, I'm just going to briefly touch upon a research which Equate conducted in 2023, and this was around women's experiences within the Scottish STEM ecosystem. We encountered a number of findings. I'm just going to touch upon one. And surprisingly, one of the core findings of that research was women are experiencing very hostile and unequal workplaces in Scotland, where we surveyed about 105 women and non-binary people, and 68% of the respondents reported experiencing harassment or discrimination in the workplace, and 60% reported sexism in the workplace, which was either making them think, or they were thinking of leaving, or had left their previous workplace because of that. Many women felt workplaces were not inclusive or supported, and basically indicates that STEM environments, as we'd like to believe, are not neutral. They are highly gendered spaces, which then is almost influencing and is central to occupational segregation, because it's our understanding, these women are leaving these jobs not because they're technically less qualified or less skilled, because that ecosystem is not able to create a safe space for them. We also, that research also highlighted that women were less likely to remain in core STEM fields for these very reasons. And also it was not about what we called education, but labor market sorting. So almost like the labor market using a gender filter to filter out women from technical roles because of gendered reason. And for that reason, there were lesser women who were then going further up the pipeline, which meant they were being underrepresented in leadership, which, as I've explained, is vertical segregation. So quickly, just to kind of go across the trends we are seeing in different STEM sectors, I would say the UK is showing strong gender clustering across different STEM occupations, where women are highly concentrated in healthcare, life sciences, educated STEM related roles, and I've briefly mentioned the reason earlier on why. And men are dominating engineering, construction, computing, and IT. And there is an overall underrepresentation of women across the STEM ecosystem, but it's highly concentrated in the engineering, construction, and manufacturing fields. In I would say we are observing a gradual increase in female participation within STEM kind of pipeline. However, there's a significant overall gender imbalance, and there's extreme segregation in highly paid technical fields, as I've repeatedly said, which are engineering and computing. And it's compounded by what we're observing is a high level of attrition for women who are early and mid careers in these fields. I'll be kind of reflecting on a report which was published last year, and there's some shocking numbers on women leaving to the thousands annually, and that's an absolute loss of talent. So that's basically the leaky pipeline. So you've got the segregation happening right in the beginning of the pipeline. We are getting fewer women in, but even the women that are entering the pipeline, they're not staying. And I would say the lazy analysis in here is we normally allocate the response. I'm being a little controversial here by using that term, but in my view, it's allocating responsibility on women by saying, okay, women have the motherhood penalty, they've got the care responsibilities going for them, therefore they're leaving. It's not them. The problem is not women. The problem is the system, which is not able to sustain that, and we'll see why. Okay, I'm just going to move on to the next slide here. So just to briefly cover this report, some of you may be familiar with this. This is called the Lovelace Report, and I did a very brief occupational segregation analysis on this. This report talks about a lot of things happening within the tech sector. The key findings of this report is around the number of women that are leaving the tech sector annually. So you're talking about 40 to 60,000 women are leaving the sector every year. And that attrition is costing the UK economy around 3.2 to 3.5 billion annually, and billion pounds. And while women only represent 20% of the tech workforce, what it means is that there's lesser representation of women further up the pipeline. And the key drivers, now this is what I would really want us to reflect on, is not because of childcare or because, of wanting to start a family. The key driver is because they're leaving because of lack of career advancement opportunities. So 25% of the women are leaving because of lack of career advancement. 17% cited inadequate recognition. 15% pointed to pay inequity, and many also reported toxic workplace cultures and lack of support, which is kind of similar to what our research indicated earlier on as well. And the research also further indicates that women, as we already have discussed, women are in kind of concentrated in mid-level or non-core roles, and they're facing longer promotional timelines compared to their male colleagues, as long as 11 years. And they're more likely to be kind of working roles like project management. Nothing wrong with that, but they're more likely to be working in UX design, project management, HR, operational roles, whereas men being dominating the core technical roles, which is software engineering, cybersecurity, and infrastructure engineering. And these roles are the ones which tend to have higher salaries, prestige, and promotion opportunities. This report also talks about a bit about vertical segregation, or what we call the sticky middle, where women remain stuck at mid-career levels because promotions are so slow or inaccessible, or there's lack of transparency on how progression is being made in these roles. So this again creates a glass ceiling, which is reinforcing the vertical segregation in the industry. Just going to quickly move on. I'd like to just share a few case studies in terms of good practice from our own stables, so to speak. We at Equate Scotland, we work with all the stakeholders within the STEM ecosystem, and that includes employers, higher education providers, women, as well as policymakers, and making sure that we do our best to kind of address some of the barriers in the workforce. Now, this is a project from perspective of horizontal segregation. I think it's a very close to heart project, where we worked with a group of refugee women who were from Ukraine. We helped them familiarize themselves with the employability landscape in Scotland, and then we worked with a smaller cohort who were given the opportunity in accessing technical training on software engineering, where these women then went through a whole boot camp with other technical partners. And then 10 of these women then went on to become successful coders, working with Code First Girls and gaining a qualification, and they were recruited through a proper interview process by NatWest. Now, this is a perfect example of how, when entities like ourselves and the commercial sector decide to join hands, and we can produce results like this, where we are creating those tangible outcomes for progression for women. Another case study I'd like to really reflect on, it's called our Career Enhancement Program. This is something we have started delivering, I think, over the last 7-8 years, basically addressing our way of addressing vertical segregation, where we work with junior and mid-level career applicants from specific STEM. So we cluster them from different kind of STEM backgrounds, and we work with cohorts where we work with women through a leadership program and give them tools which helps them map their strengths and also helps them map their transferable skills, because it's all about being able to reflect on, breaking those norms and stereotypes about what skills are needed for these roles or these managerial roles, and help them map those skills and also apply for development opportunities within their own organizations. We also help them develop effective communication skill, which is a key leadership skill, and we help them develop their leadership potential. So this is like a boot camp, which is stretched across 3 months, and we require commitment from the employer in terms of allowing their staff to come and access this opportunity, commitment from the individuals and ourselves. And just to kind of wrap up, this is a suite of offerings, training offerings. We offer various employers on how they can improve on their own working practices, right from inclusive culture, leadership, different sort of biases, authority gap, how do you challenge and prevent discrimination at work. So as Anna pointed out, this seems to be a big problem. And sometimes it gets so overwhelming. Where do we tackle it from? And what I'm trying to showcase here is there are different avenues, there's different ways of addressing this, and each does its own job. I'd like to just end with a little video, which is around it's about a minute long, Kelsey, so I'll be about 30 seconds, or I do apologize. This is
Dilraj, I'm just wondering if maybe it would be better to put that, we can put that in the Q&A, just so we've got enough time for Susie and the Q&A afterwards, that we can put the video
sure,
for
that's
participants
fine.
to
Then I'm
watch
going to
on their.
stop here.
Thanks.
Oh, sorry. Apologies. But over to you, Kelsey. Thank you.
Thanks, Dilraj. It was helpful for hearing about some of the barriers that women in the STEM sector face. So I'll just stop spotlighting you, and I'll just then quickly pass over to Susie Hayward, who is from Gender Friendly Scotland, who works on challenging gender stereotypes in early years and wrote a book along with her colleague, Challenging Gender Stereotypes in Early Years, Changing the Narrative. So I'll pass over to you then, Susie. You're just on mute.
Failed at the first hurdle, sorry about that. You can see the slides okay, I'm assuming. So just let me know if there's any problems with them. So thank you so much for having me. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work that I've been doing around gender inequality for a number of years now, as a bit of an example of practice, as what could be seen as an upstream way of tackling occupational segregation. So if you think about that cradle to grave pipeline that Anna mentioned in her presentation, this work that we were doing is kind of right at the start of that, as our approach is really focused on addressing inequality in the very earliest years of life. So this is going to be a whistle-stop tour. I apologise, good luck with the live captioning, because I talk fast and I've got loads to cover, but I will stick with my time, I promise. Okay, now I see if I can change the slide. So as I say, my name's Susie Haywood. I've been working in public health for over 15 years on a variety of topics, including mental health and suicide prevention. This is a photo of me and my colleague Barbara Agilich, and about 10 years ago or so, we came up with an idea for an approach called the Gender Friendly Nursery. which we developed for NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde. And since then, we've been delivering kind of a variety of inputs and training and talks around this topic. And more recently, we're invited to write a book focused on tackling gender stereotypes in the early years. So the impacts of gender inequality are clear, they're serious, and they affect all of us, and they create gendered health harms, unequal access to education, employment, and unequal access to power. So they determine things like who's more likely to experience violence, who's more likely to spend time in prison, who's more likely to suffer a drug-related death, who's more likely to die by suicide, experience a mental health problem or an eating disorder, and who gets to do what and earn what. And we've heard loads of examples of that already so far, so I don't really need to go into that in any depth. So at the root of that gender inequality are gender stereotypes. These start in childhood, and we see children being put into boxes depending on whether they're a boy or a girl. And these boxes outline what's expected of them, how they should act, what they should look like, how they should behave, what they can do, and what they can aspire to be. And these boxes lay the groundwork for the expectations which will follow them into adulthood. So, for example, we tell young boys not to cry, and then we expect men to be strong and not to show emotion. We compliment young girls on their appearance and what they're wearing. We call them cute, we call them pretty, but we're subtly planting the seed that their value lies in how they look, and then adult women are then policed on how they dress, their body size and shape, and as they try to kind of tread that fine line between being sexy and not too sexy. We give girls toys which allow them to flex those domestic muscles, things like dolls, prams, cuddly toys, kitchens. And then we judge women who appear to be putting their careers before their families, or who choose not to have children at all. And then we give boys active toys, building blocks, tools, trucks, weapons, and we encourage them to flex their actual muscles and then expect them to grow up being tough in high-earning, bread-winning type jobs, and then judge men who step outside of those traditionally male jobs. So in our book, for example, we reflected on the suspicion which follows men who move into working in careers in childcare, for example, and the impact that that has on the workforce, and I guess essentially the children in those settings. And just to reiterate, these stereotypes and the gender inequality that they produce are a factor in many of the public health and societal issues that we see in Scotland today. And so the work that we've done focuses on tackling these stereotypes in the early years as upstream prevention for these issues. And this slide really demonstrates what, I guess, the kind of theory behind what we're trying to do. So it rests on the belief that if we can reduce the impact of these stereotypes in the early years of life, then we can change children's beliefs and attitudes to gender roles as they grow. They can make choices about their life that are based on skills, abilities, and talent, not on whether they are a boy or a girl. And the hope is, I guess, that by changing attitudes to gender roles, we can reduce gender inequality, reduce these public health, educational, and occupational impacts. But why the early years? Now, I'm not going to go into this in detail, but there's just a couple of points I want to make. So the first is that one of the very first identity categories that children understand is whether they are a boy or a girl. And then they pick up on cues from adults around them about what that means for them, what that means for how they should behave and act. And even from the age of 2, there's evidence that children begin to modify their behaviour as a result of these kind of presumed expectations based on their gender. So then as they grow a bit older, they then develop fairly rigid ideas of what's expected of boys and girls, and most children will conform to these and they'll apply them both to themselves and to other people. The good news is that that relaxes as they grow older, but essentially from a very, very early age, children are like little gender detectives looking for clues all around them about what it means to be a boy or a girl. And these clues are everywhere, and they start early, sometimes before they're even born, because as soon as As adults, we find out if a baby is a boy or a girl. It then changes how we speak about them, how we speak to them, the words that we use with them, the words that we use to describe them, the toys we give them, what we believe about what they can do, their actual physical abilities, what we aspire, what we think is in their potential futures. And pretty much all of that is based on these gender stereotypes. And then it continues. So the media that children are consuming, kids' TV programming and films give them subtle and sometimes not so subtle clues about what boys, girls, men and women should look like, what roles they can play, what jobs they can do. The list goes on. The messages are reinforced through toys, books, stories and clothing as well. And they continue into adolescence and adulthood. So this slide's just a kind of mash of different kind of examples on topics that we cover in our book, but looks at things like the gaming industry, social media, pornography, the advertising industry, how men are portrayed in TV and film. Again, all reflecting kind of these harmful and reductive gender stereotypes about men and women, relationships and violence. So these stereotypes are everywhere. We can't avoid them. They affect the way we see the world. They affect the way we see ourselves. They affect the decisions that we make and the way that we perceive and judge other people. And I just want to touch on a few other concepts which I think are important when it comes to thinking about this in relation to occupational segregation. So we know through the work of neuroscientists that there's really nothing innate in our brains that explain why more men than women end up in careers involving things like science and maths, and why women are more represented in lower paid caring type roles. However, we do know that by the age of about 6, girls are less likely to believe that they and other girls can be really, really smart, and are less likely to choose to do activities that are seen as for children who are really, really smart. So we talk about a kind of spark of genius, and that being kind of societally associated with excellence in maths and sciences, and that is seen by children to be a boy thing, that kind of spark of genius. And we also know that gender stereotypes can influence what people think that they can do. So you may have heard of the kind of concept of stereotype threat. Essentially, that means, so if you're a girl and you're aware that there's a stereotype that says girls are no good at maths, then this will actually affect your performance in maths. So when female students were asked to take part in a study and told that the activity that they were about to do was in an area where males tended to outperform females, they did way worse than those who were told something else. So we internalize the stereotype. It affects our confidence, it affects our outputs, and it affects our choices. So simple exposure to different activities matters too. It determines the skills that we develop. So here's like a really simple exact kind of early years based example. So the stereotype is that we believe that girls prefer playing with dolls. So therefore we give girls dolls and we don't give them like construction toys like building blocks, Lego, that sort of thing. So then she doesn't get to try using those toys, or doesn't get as much of an opportunity to use those kinds of toys. And she doesn't develop the spatial awareness skills that come from regularly doing those types of activities. And so she starts to think when she does do it, she's not very good at it, so she must be bad at it. Nobody likes doing things that they're bad at, so she just doesn't enjoy it and stops doing it, avoids it, never develops those skills. And as a society, we believe then that we have the evidence that girls naturally prefer to play with dolls. So hopefully you can see that kind of vicious cycle. I just also quickly wanted to note the important role that adults and educators play to often subtly reinforcing stereotypes through the way they interact with children. Most of this will not even be consciously done because, of course, all of us grew up exposed to the same stereotypes, internalising the same messages, and it's natural that that will impact on our interactions with and beliefs about children, whether we're aware of it or not. I've been doing this kind of work for about 10 years now, and I am constantly still catching myself doing or saying stuff that doesn't sit well alongside the stuff that I'm writing and talking about. So what can we do about all this? So the 3 approaches that I champion are reducing gender stereotypes, challenging them, and compensating for them. So reduction kind of does what it says on the tin, reducing children's exposure to gender stereotypes by eliminating them. So it could be about carefully choosing resources and stories which don't include gender stereotypes, changing your language to ensure you're not reinforcing them. Loads of examples that I could talk about. A really famous example of this that you may have heard of is the Igalia nurseries in Sweden. This was kind of controversial a few years back, and I'm going to simplify it here. If you want to learn more about this approach, we wrote about it in our book, but essentially the Igalia nurseries attempt to reduce the impact of stereotypes by utilising a gender-neutral curriculum, a gender-neutral nursery environment, and kind of using neutral resources and language. That the language was the bit that got all the coverage. And essentially it's an attempt to remove any barriers that might prevent children from doing what they want to do because of gendered expectations. Is that enough? I personally don't think so. I think it's really helpful to take these kind of gender neutral approaches, but as we've already seen, the world is not a gender neutral place, and I think a kind of more active approach is needed, which is where the principles of challenge and compensation come in. For anyone who didn't see this programme on the BBC, I would highly recommend it if it's still on there. It's called No More Boys and Girls. It's a 2-part documentary, and a teacher was supported to work with his class of, I think they were 7 or 8-year-olds, to, I think they said, to turn the class gender neutral. Essentially, the idea was to see whether this would make a difference to their attitudes and ideas about what boys and girls, men and women could do. And although they talked about turning the class gender neutral, in reality, they went far further than that. There were elements of reduction. So there was they worked with the teacher to stop using gendered kind of pet names for the children, which he tended to do. But there were also elements of challenge. So we saw children being asked how they thought that they would do on a kind of one of these strength tests, where you hit the hammer onto the thing and try and hit the bell. And as you might expect, the class kind of predicted that boys would do way better. But in reality, when they did the activity, they really demonstrated that actually girls were doing just as well as boys. And yeah, an interesting one to watch. And then there were elements of this idea of compensation. So one that I found interesting was around the kind of use of tangrams. Don't know if you know tangrams, that's where you're fitting together all the shapes to make a shape. And they found that girls were really struggling with that. And when they tested them, they were not doing as well as the boys. So then what they did was they kind of introduced a kind of programme of opportunities for girls in particular to practice tangrams and to do other activities which supported their development of those kind of spatial awareness skills. And then they retested them after a while later, I don't know if it was weeks or months, and they saw that the scores had kind of levelled out and that girls were doing just as good or even overtaking the boys on the retest. So it was really that lack of opportunity that was the problem. So this idea of compensation for me is a really important bit. It's essentially equity in action. It's about understanding the stereotypes, the ideas, the gender role pressures that children are hearing and internalising, and providing them with a new narrative, helping them to see that all options are open to them. So giving them opportunities to take part in activities, to learn skills that perhaps the world doesn't offer them because they are a boy or a girl. So really trying to counteract those stereotypes proactively. And that's going to look different for boys and for girls because the messages they get are different. So a gender neutral approach to me will not suffice. And of course, gender stereotypes are only part of the problem and only one of the ways in which people are put into boxes and have their aspirations and choices limited. So working in an intersectional way as we do this is really important, and it should be core part of the approach, not so much of an afterthought. So I'm just about there. The approach that we outline in our book pulls all 3 of these kind of approaches together into what is a kind of whole setting approach to tackling gender stereotypes. So it looks at what actions can be taken by and with the various people involved in nursery life, the environment, the practices of the nursery, what things get taught, which resources get used, interactions, policies, staff recruitment, staff management, the whole lot. And I guess we fully believe that if we can change things in the early years and show children that they do not need to stay in these boxes, then we will make a difference. And I've yet to kind of meet someone who thinks that limiting the future potential and dreams of children is a good thing for anyone. So if you're interested to learn more about any of this, the best place to start is the book, but we've also got a website. We don't really keep it up to date, but there are a few resources and things that might be of interest there. And I'm always happy to kind of talk to people about the work that we've been doing. So that is me. I will stop sharing.
Great, thanks, Susie. It's really helpful to hear some of those examples that you had highlighted. I'm just going to stop spotlighting you. Did anyone have any questions for our three speakers? I'll just spotlight all of you so you can. Whilst we wait for any questions to come through, we have a bit of time left. I've got one question for you, Susie, about if you have any examples of good practice in Scotland around addressing gender stereotypes in early years.
Yeah, I mean, there's been loads. There's loads over the years. So Zero Tolerance have got some really good resources around gender equal play. I would signpost people to those if they're interested in having a look. The Education Scotland did some work way back. We were involved in that, and they used a lot of our early materials that we developed for Glasgow City. And it was they had something called the Improving Gender Balance and Equalities team, and they developed a kind of programme. It was linked to kind of STEM. I think it was through the Institute of Physics to kind of and developed a programme that went from early years right through to secondary school to kind of develop positive practice around reducing gender stereotypes. So I'm not sure if that's still going, but I'm sure if it's not, there'll be a legacy of that work. And then there's just loads of other little pockets of practice. I mentioned the gender-friendly nursery work that we developed in Glasgow. I'm no longer involved in that piece of work, but it's there. I'm not 100% sure if it's still being delivered, but there's lots of bits and pieces, and it just feels like we keep coming back to this. I've been doing it for 10 years and it waxes and wanes, but it does feel like we're still not quite getting it right. So it's probably more to be done.
Yeah, I think this is something that comes up quite a bit with work that we do with employers, as well as how do they address gender stereotypes within schools, and also looking at what to do once it's in the workplace and if there's anything that can be done once it's in employment. So we've got a question for you, Dilraj, about the lack of women in IT and AI, or on AI development, if you had any comments, thoughts on that.
Well, the Lovelace report pretty much it's a very good resource, and I'll send you the link to it, Kelsey. Please feel free to share it with folks. I think it's a very comprehensive review of the tech ecosystem, which would cover AI as well. What we've encountered in our work is, excuse my language, is kind of what we call the bro culture within the tech ecosystem. So that a lot of the startups which we know are founded by folk who are extremely intelligent, extremely talented, and who've probably just left school and done a bit of high school and a bit of college, and they've turned up into these tech superstars. And what they've not realized is that, you know, there are gender norms, and there are the workplace has to be equitable. And what we've encountered is that these, especially SMEs and startups, which seem to be the smaller organizations, they tend to have a lot of this entrenched bro culture. SDS has produced, in partnership with us, a number of resources to address changing those kind of behaviors and cultures. But it's such a complex problem. It just depends, where are you addressing this from? Where are you coming at it from an employer's point of view, or are you coming at it from an individual who wants to get into that sector? Every solution would be different. So, but yeah, I would say the Lovelace report is a good starting point, and SDS would also be a good place for you to look at what sort of we've created quite a few resources for them for that space.
Great, thanks, Raj. Yes, I can send a follow-up email with all the links that you've mentioned. So that's the end of the time that we have for the webinar today. So thank you everyone for joining us for our first webinar, and thanks again to our great speakers, Anna, Dilraj and Susie. That was a lot of information, I think, to cover. So I think probably people are taking a lot of that away to process and see how they can embed it into their own practice. So thanks very much, and we'll share the recording afterwards. So I hope everyone has a good afternoon. Bye now.
And thank you for the invite. Bye.
Thank you.